Okay, everybody, welcome back to the third week of the new series, Gender and Economics Online Workshop. Today we're going to discuss and have comments on the gender employment gap, which in Vietnam, and the effects of the new extended maternity leave policy in Vietnam, which is one of the most progressive around the world. And the authors are going to use the difference in differences strategy to evaluate the effects of the policy on women's access to the labor force in different sectors. And then the difference in differences part will be differentiating women and men and women into separate groups, women of childbearing age and women not of childbearing age. So this is a paper that's of interest because it's nominally a communist country. This is a progressive social policy being instituted in a nominally communist country. I think it's interesting I think we should mention, and it's interesting from an institutional point of view, to see pro-social policies being implemented in countries where there may not be fully representative democracy or fully representative institutions. And very encouraging signs that in this context that there's pro-social policies going on as well, and that economists can contribute to the measurement of and hopefully the propagation of further of those policies. So here's the site, just so that it's here. These are two Vietnamese authors from a Vietnamese uni, and the UNU Wider is the UN's research arm. I forget where it is. I think it's somewhere in Europe, the actual physical location. So in the past, prior to the 2012 labor law reforms, Vietnam had some of the least progressive maternity leave policies. This is also of interest because in the US we have no officially sanctioned or legislated rules for maternity leave, and it's something that gets discussed a lot that in America that we can't even guarantee our mothers maternity leave. And I think that one of the interesting things about that is that women in the United States, even without the government guaranteed maternity leave, often don't have such a long time off of work. So I think the data might cover over the fact that some people are disproportionately affected by the lack of maternity leave. It's not that difficult to imagine that it would affect different groups differently, that someone who's a single mother would benefit more from a maternity leave policy than someone who's in a partnership, because in a partnership, and it doesn't have to be a man and a woman, obviously, it could be lesbian couple or any combination. And in a partnership, you have the insurance of the income of the other partner while you're busy not working and taking care of the child. So it's kind of an automatic insurance. And so that seems to make sense that single mothers would be more susceptible and more vulnerable, and that these laws, maternity leave policies, especially well-enforced maternity leave policies, might benefit mothers more. One of the important aspects, so Vietnam implemented this law in 2012. It was a broad and sweeping law that instituted a bunch of new changes. And the law provided for 100% pay maternity leave policy for 6 months. Now, one of the important aspects of this question is, will this introduction of the new maternity leave policy, even if it raises the employment level of a certain subset of the Vietnamese population, women, will it all affect all of the sections of the Vietnamese population of working women the same? And the authors spend quite some time trying to detail how it affects different subpopulations of women differently. So there is the concern, potentially, just before we move on, there is the concern that this could exacerbate differentials and create further inequalities in access to labor markets. So that's one of the discussion points that the authors touch on. And it's not just, oh, this is a rosy, happy party to celebrate this maternity leave policy getting rolled out. There's serious concerns here. The authors raise those concerns. They're not dodging them. And in general, I think this is a well-executed difference in differences strategy. And for students out there who are considering doing a PhD or who are a graduate student writing a master's thesis, most of you are going to be doing empirical work, okay? And this is the exact kind of empirical work that you could be reading that would help inform the kind of research that you want to do. And that's because a great deal of student research, because most students don't get access to fancy primary data, most student research is with observational data, and we do difference and differences strategy. We come up with some observational experiment or some natural experiment that allows us to do difference and differences analysis, which is what they've done here. Okay, so looking at maternity leave policies around the world, I don't know why the US is shaded in at 12 to 13 weeks. That doesn't sound right to me. It might be state by state, but we see an overview from ILO data. This comes directly from the paper about which countries have the most liberal and most progressive maternity leave policies. We see that Italy, Australia, and Vietnam are within the same category of 18 weeks or more. And many of the Western European countries allow 14 to 17 weeks, and also Canada. This is just an overview. So the data that the authors are going to use is Vietnamese labor survey data coming from successive waves measured in 2008, 2009, 2010, all the way up to 2016. And they break the sample into the pre-law period and the post-law period. Now, before we go on, I want to highlight a confounding effect that I just thought about. So they mention in the article how the labor laws instituted sweeping reforms across a number of categories. It absolutely could be the case. That's bad, okay? When you're doing a scientific experiment, you only want to change one variable at a time. That's the kind of logic that we need to think of when we're executing an empirical economic experiment. If there are confounding factors, in other words, other aspects of the law that influence women's labor force participation differentially, that would cover over the effects and it would make it difficult for us to say, oh, this is the effect of interest. So in this case, we just have an overview table of women's share of employment. In the sample of the total employment, women are 50%. And the total labor force participation is 82%. We're going to have some breakdowns here by categories in a second, which I think are just more interesting. Just note that the sample is 95,000 individuals. These are not linked in a panel data. This is just pooled data. And there's going to be different categories of employment because you have wage employment and formal jobs. Wage employment is like individuals who get paid daily to do daily jobs. And formal employment is like you get a monthly salary and you have an annual contract. So the biggest effects of this policy are going to show up in wage employment, which, are going to show up in the formal job market, and wage employment less. So we're going to see that there are these differentials, and that's exactly why the authors spend their time taking these subsets of the population apart. Okay, I find these graphs very busy, but they're informative. So they should be doubly informative if you're thinking about data viz, because I think that they're just trying to do too much with the graphs, with having the 4 bars. Maybe it's that, or maybe it's the colors. But the bars show the years, and the colors show the years, and then we see the share of labor. So 2012 is when the policy was implemented. So we would want to be looking for changes in labor force participation that happened differentially after the orange and before the blue column. And then that would illustrate some effect. So this is women of childbearing age and different levels. And we see that there were strong effects for formal jobs. And you look at that break between those who have a primary education but who work in the formal sector, and also the secondary school. And also there seems to have been a decline, interestingly, among college labor force participation among women of childbearing age. Okay. So this is the gap. So this is one of the indicators that the authors are looking to break down. And we can see the gap in employment and labor force participation over time, that the men have a slightly higher level of labor force participation. Now, ignore the not married column for a second and just look at the married line on top, the 2 married lines, married men and married women. It does not look that we see any narrowing of that gap. And that's what the authors conclude at the end, is that in the end, this policy has not affected the labor force participation of women relative to men overall. And that was one of the aims, as well as closing the wage gap. So just by looking at this sort of visually, it's really good when you're writing a paper to have one graph. You can kind of tell the whole story of the paper in one graph. And this is one of those types of graphs. If anything, we see that among not married women and men, that the wedge between labor force participation in men and women is widening on the bottom part, as we see that looks like at 2014, women take a downturn, so that the labor force participation of unmarried women seems to be decreasing between 2014 and 2016, which is kind of worrisome also. Okay. Yeah.
Also, do you notice like that there's like a seems to be compression between between the married labor supply, but the unmarried labor supply seems to be separating it from 2014 to 2016.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah. Like, do you
definitely.
think? Yeah, like, do you think that do you think there's a cause for why there's a difference between married and unmarried in this case?
Yeah, because I think that this is for me a story of social status and wealth linked with social status. When you're married, first of all, you have the insurance of being married. We just talked about that, right? So you have the insurance of being married, and you can cover one aspect of that might be that you can sustain a longer period of unemployment to find a better job fit. So that's just one thing. But also, in general, you're more wealthy because you have the assets of both of the other one, and you have the synergistic effects of amplifying the other one's well-being. So, and I think that that not married, there's a story of low social capital, and that explains the widening. It explains somewhat the widening between unmarried men and unmarried women, because unmarried women appear to have the lowest levels of social capital here, being most marginalized or out of the labor force.
I don't know how common this case would be, but I imagine if you are a single mother, you definitely, I mean, not definitely, but if it's hard for you to get by in terms of money, you would go back to your families or get together with other people. I don't think I mean, I don't think, I think some women with children decide to go back home because they can't deal with the responsibilities, but I still don't see how this goes like a little bit downward, like,
Um,
that's the only thing I can think of.
and one more thing, just this might be a bit semantics, but like I think saying married unmarried is a bit. I think it implies too much formality to marriage, especially in some rural parts. And you might want to say like formally married or something, because there could be a selection bias for those who have access to like court systems and stuff.
But this is from Vietnam also, so
Yeah,
I don't know about Vietnam social costumes.
Well, there's also selection into getting married, right? Presumably the better quality candidates get. I mean, I know that sounds gross, but presumably the
yeah,
better
because
quality. Okay. Well, let me just
no,
mention also, just to build on what Leslie was saying, which I think is very insightful comment, that we don't know, because this could also be covering over widows. And it sort of echoes what you're saying also, Danny, which is that these categories are masking some other categories about, which is women never married before, right? And then women who are widowed and divorcees. So, and there's now a growing literature on that.
and
And
and the
so the
one more
gap might
category,
be widening among widows, but it might be the same among unmarried women, never married women, and never married men, right?
and also people who also people who want who think it's worthwhile to participate in the legal system and legally get recognized as married, because you could be
That's
married
true.
informally. And that's what I was trying to point out, which is that especially in like rural parts where they don't have access to courts, the marriage might be like informal. That's where I was a bit concerned with the semantics.
No, 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 no. I totally understand. And there's repressed ethnic minorities in Vietnam also, or there's underrepresented ethnic minorities. So in those cases, it also might be that those individuals avoid the official channels with respect to marriage. So I would have to look at the survey, and maybe you can email the authors if they're not clear about what their distinction is between married and not married. And for example, in African survey data, it has cohabiting and married separately. As you were saying, those are sometimes kind of two different things, or they can sometimes be functionally the same thing. Any other thoughts?
There's some voice text.
Yes.
Oh, well, that's just a comment.
Yes, dual income home. Yes, exactly. Okay, thank you for the comments. I appreciate comments and questions. Okay, so um, so this on the right side, this is the formal job, the percentage with the who are employed in a formal job, and this is the area that the authors find the largest effects of the policy. And in this case, we see that the story looks quite different. Oh, can I just mention also in this case, on the 2014 to 2016, there could be something happening economically in this time period, so that we don't know that might affect women differentially. So that's just another thing that's worth thinking about. That could be conditional on this specific time period in the world, whichever was going on between 2014 and 2016 in Vietnam. For the case of wage jobs, we see some kind of widening of the gap in terms of employment between female married and not married. So not married seems to be disadvantaging not married women. Again, sort of similar to the other graphs. And this fits with the kind of broader social story that widows and single women and divorced women are among the most marginalized groups. And there's I've been active in that literature, and I'm working on a paper in that literature, then analyzing widows' well-being in the African context and in South American context. So, that fits with a consistent story across many cultures, which I think is also intuitive when you think about our own cultures, or I don't know, maybe some of you are from Vietnam, but I just think when I'm thinking about my own culture, and I think about how widows would be treated and divorcees, and in the circles that I move in, even, not to sound arrogant, but even, in the wealthy country is what I mean by that. We still see divorced and widowed women facing social stigma that is strong and negative. So I think it's an intuitive story, and I think that's something powerful in econ when you have an intuitive story that matches with the data. So we see a closing of the employment differential in the formal job sector as well, and it seems to benefit not married men. The maternity leave policy, and I think that the authors there's some strange findings in the paper that I think that they don't offer much explanation for. Let me just look through my notes here. Okay. So again, just to get a visual and a sense overall of the effects on the differential effects between the wage job sector and the formal job sector, and the authors talk to some extent about the differences between wage job sectors and formal job sectors. But again, the largest effect of this maternity leave policy appears to benefit women who are working, women of childbearing age who work in formal sector jobs. And that's why we see these closing here. Okay, so this is the regression tables. I'm sorry if you're not an econometrics person and you're just going to have to let your eyes glaze over for one moment. But mostly this is the coefficient of interest. Okay, I chopped off the bottom of the table because it's huge. This is the coefficient of interest. It's an interaction effect with the year the law took place and the woman being of childbearing age but without having a child. The idea being that women with a child are much less likely to need access to maternity leave. And so the effect would be potentially largest for women who did not have a child yet. And they see this 1.9 percentage point increase in the probability of having a formal job. And again, that's reflective of this changes that we see going on here in this formal job image here. After 2012 would be, they should have a line here when the law got implemented. And so after 2012 would be when we see this increasing, steady increasing, and even an uptick. This looks like quite a steep line, and an uptick in the employment rate of women in the formal job sector.
Do they have any measurement of bureaucratic efficiency? Because it could have been that the implementation of new laws gives you new data points, which can make it so it's easier to optimize. Like for example, have this law might require better analysis of like workplace and like and like of like both workplaces and of like where people live and have better census data so they can administer this better, which makes it so it's more easier for people to get formal sector jobs.
I don't know. I don't know. Good
My
question.
apologies.
No, no worries. So this is the kind of what we might think of as the unconditional employment gap, having a wage job, and we see that women have, especially women with children, are much less likely to have a wage job. And so this is kind of the idea of why they're targeting this maternity leave policy, is because they would like to reduce these coefficients here, such that the employment effect of having a baby is not anything, so that you keep your employment, you keep your wage, and you're made whole by the maternity leave policy, and you can spend time with your kids as well. And then this column, the dependent variable is income. So in this column, it's 1, 0, have a wage job. So these are the coefficients with respect to that model. This is the same, but with a formal sector job. And the last is the log of income. This is continuous. So we see these like unconditional wage gaps here. We see these are quite large gaps in pay and their income. This is also somewhat confusing. I don't remember what their explanation was on the side of the income part, because in theory, this should close the gap in between women and men, giving them this maternity leave policy, 6 months and 100% full-time pay. So you would think that that would make them whole and not make them worse off relative to men.
I think differently because maybe the companies are paying them less that they actually are valued for, and the women take it because it's better to go into the formal sector and get the paid leave than not having any, and also have guaranteed job after.
I'm just having a look. They also say that in most other countries, the pay gap has decreased, and there's a citation here. They kind of sidestep talking about the income thing. So I think that's why I'm having trouble finding where they talk about the effects on income. All I see is in the results section under section 4.1. They're talking about that table that I just have here on the screen, and they say in tables 2 and 3, the third column reports the log monthly income. All groups of women have lower monthly incomes than men at 24.7% lower, at 24% lower. And that is because exponential of 0.87 is equal to 2.4. These are in log scale. And based on ILO data, the gender pay gap is positive in most countries. Women earn less than men. The change in the gender pay gap, it tends to have increased by 4%. And they don't say anything else. So if I was a reviewer, I would probably not have nice things to say about that, because it doesn't make sense that it should be increasing the wage gap. And maybe you should just exclude the income story if you just want to. Anyway, okay. Rant over. These graphs were a little confusing to me at first, but I think I can explain them to you. So these are the coefficients estimated by industry, okay? So when we come back here, this is what we think of as the coefficient of interest, which is women that don't have kids times the year of the imposition of the law in 2012, okay? And so what the authors did was they did the same estimations, except they did them by industry. They gathered up those coefficients from here, and they checked them, and they plotted them here against the other coefficients from the other industries, so that we can see all the industries stacked up here, okay? And this is women who already had a child, and this is women who have no child. So we can see here that when we look at the women who already have a child, we see mostly ambiguous effects. We see it sort of evenly balanced, both the formal job and the wage jobs around the line of 0. Whereas in the female without an infant, or the women without an infant category, if we look at the orange, which is the formal job sector, the one that we see in the data is more affected, these orange dots tend to this right-hand side. So I think that the story that's being told here, when you look at this, is that we see some statistically significant also positive effects for these industries in terms of the gender employment gap. And I have a gripe with this also, which I think is that they should label these. Let me tell you what they are. Let me get they're in the back
number
here.
14, because
Just
there's a
here, I got
switch.
them. 14 is other services.
Of course, the least descriptive one has the most interesting consequence because it flips.
So 3 is manufacturing. So there's an unambiguous positive effect in manufacturing industry and water supply. 7 is transportation and storage. So that looks statistically significant in the formal job sector, right? Because those are the confidence intervals, those lines sticking outside of the dot. And if those lines don't cross the 0 line, that means it's statistically significant and positive. Does that make sense? Those are the confidence intervals there, those bars on either side of the dots. In information and communication, number 9, we also see the positive effect, and that's it. And we see some negative effects statistically significant in construction and in wholesale and retail trade. This could also be retaliation against women. The authors talk a lot about discrimination against women, and they talk about how there are a lot of intangible factors that affect this, such as employers discriminating against them already because they're of childbearing age and not giving them a job in the first place because they are concerned they would have a baby, and also this general social stigma about not taking maternity leave policy, which they talk about in the paper. And if you're seen as being disloyal to the company the longer the maternity leave is that you take. So these are kind of social stigmas and social factors that might not be quantifiable, but that could be operating in this context. Okay, so in conclusion, to wrap it up, the authors analyzed the 2012 Vietnamese labor law implementation of a paid maternity leave policy. The paid maternity leave offered 6 months of paid maternity leave at 100% pay guaranteed by the government. And the authors hypothesized that this would affect the employment gap, the labor force participation gap, and the employment gap. The authors also analyzed differences in income. And they found positive effects of the maternity law in principle or in general, statistically significant for the formal job sector, benefiting mostly women who are in the formal job sector. But we see indistinguishable other effects for women who are outside the formal job sector, although somewhat in the wage sector as well. And though the effects are somewhat ambiguous of implementing of the maternity law, and we still have some maternity leave law, and we still have some questions about why the effects are showing up the way they are, in particular, increasing the income gap. It seems like maternity leave policies are generally supported, and most Western countries have somewhat progressive maternity leave policies. Any questions? Yeah, go ahead, Danny, but I'm opening up to anybody having any questions or comments.
Is there any analysis of the health effects? Because, like, for example, like a lot of women, like children, are left in much worse condition because they're forced to work through pregnancy, which can put stress on them and physically drain them when they're
I don't know, and I would imagine that would be worse.
Yeah. Some women have hormonal changes, and some women have problem with their periods. Sometimes when they get pregnant, they also have problem with their pregnancies. Some women need more than the maternity leave because they get like in a position where they are endangered, and if they can, basically they can't move because if they move, they have risk to losing the baby.
Yeah,
So yeah.
and also back. I wonder if there's probably also something with back issues because
and postpartum depression. Right? You might need more than 6 months because after the 6 months, you might be depressed and not ready to go back to work.
Yeah, and also, I was also going to focus on the fact that there might be like a pre-maternity leave. Like instead of just focusing on post-birth, you have to focus on pre-birth. Like the is there any policies about? Is this policy only covering after birth, or is it covering like be like while you are pregnant?
I'm not
And
sure.
what I've seen in the place I work is if the women wants the time before because of these problems um, with having the baby, they just shift the time. They don't ask more time.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
Unfortunate though.
yeah,
I mean, that's consistent with the kind of practices that don't support women's well-being in a way that's holistic for their employment prospects. Um, so yeah, so the postpartum depression thing also, and I think that they talk in the paper about, paternity leave also, which I think offers an additional, cushion. And then that relieves the pressure on maternity leave because if you can have both at home also, some places have this kind of either or strategy. But I think that the ideal thing is to have both working and also to have both off from work. And then you have a kind of insurance of one taking care of the stuff that the other might not be able to or might not be filling up for. So, um, in any case, it was an interesting paper, a really good example of difference in differences analysis with observational data. So anybody out there who's a student who's thinking of writing their own research paper using observational data, secondhand data, which is what most of the research is for PhD students, this is a good example. Though we have some open questions, it's a nice paper. All right, so let's go ahead and I'll stop the recording there.